So two very important concepts working together here at the beginning of part two. One is the notion that now the self has come to know itself thoroughly. Not completely, because I think there's one more step, but the self truly has self-knowledge and therefore has become more of a self. Now that idea is, I think, very well expressed by Kierkegaard at the bottom of page 112. He says, the despair is intensified in proportion to the consciousness of the self. But the self is intensified in proportion to the standard by which the self measures itself, and infinitely so when God is the standard. The more conception of God, the more self. The more self, the more conception of God. Only when a self, as this particular individual, that's quite important for Kierkegaard, that one relates to God not as generic human being or mankind, but relates to God as the particular individual self that one actually is. Only when a self, as this particular individual, is conscious of being before God, only then it is the infinite self. So there's quite a journey and quite really an achievement that has been made by the self to get to this point. But see what follows there. And then he says, and that self then sins before God. It's a very strange thing to say. That is, and I think for me, one of the keys to understanding Kierkegaard is how the self reacts when it realizes that it's in the presence of God. No, this is a style of Christianity, style of religion in general, a mood or a certain taste. What I mean to say is that when I hear people talking about religion and about God, they seem very happy, and they should. And that is really what Kierkegaard thinks is the final happiness, the greatest happiness, is relating to God in that way that he thinks we all should. But that, at least at this point in the stage of the consciousness of spirit, the self-consciousness of spirit, the experience of being in the presence of God is not a happy experience. How could it be if he's saying that the self goes ahead and sins? And that's something you have to, I think, really come to terms with in Kierkegaard, is that the knowledge that God exists and the knowledge that God is there and that God is paying attention to you is not, at least initially, a good experience for a spirit. At least it doesn't experience it itself from its point of view as good. It's actually seems to be quite a traumatic experience. And I think he does something in the rest of part two to explain that. But so the mystery is, why does the self sin when it realizes as much as it does realize about itself, and that it is in relation to God, that it is before God? Why does it become sinful? And why does that seem to be a necessary stage of getting to a proper relationship with God, getting into the good relationship with God, and being who you really are and who you really should be and who you have to be happy? Why is sin such a central experience of the self? I guess the question for me, I hate to go on and on about it, is why doesn't the self, once it realizes that God is there and that it is relating to God, why does the self not simply embrace God? Why does the self sin? Well, what is sin? Again, sin is wanting to be yourself or not wanting to be yourself in despair, but the emphasis in having the consciousness that all of this is before God, in the presence of God. And what makes the sin bad, in Kierkegaard's mind, is not that in some abstract sense you do something unethical, but rather that you do it in the presence of God, that you do it in an aggravated sense. Think of the relationship, or think of the behavior of a young child. Now, if you hit your little brother, that's bad, no matter what. It's always bad to hit your little brother, okay? Even if you're a very small child, hit your little brother is a bad thing. But think about hitting your little brother when your mother is right there, and you know that your mother is right there. Now, in a sense, that is really is a lot worse. One time or another, we all hit our little brother, and probably one time or another, we all hit our little brother when we know our mom's watching, but it is just worse. Why? It's aggravated. That is, there's something flagrant about it. Doing something wrong when you know that, at least at that time, your mother being the world to you, that the greatest authority there is watching and disapproving, yet you do it anyway. That I think is close to what Kierkegaard is saying sin is for us. This flagrant defiance of God. And so sin is not doing something wrong in the sense that, again, abstractly, in some way that a moral philosophy could describe what doing something wrong meant. Sin is doing something that you know God doesn't want you to do and going ahead and do it anyway. That's what makes sin sin. As he says on page 112 in the next to last paragraph, referring to earlier dogmatics, he says, which is earlier moral theology in Christianity. He says, above that, right in the middle of the second paragraph on the page, he says that what made sin so terrible was its being before God. And then he says in the next paragraph, no, in this, the earlier dogmatics was right, that the fact that sin was before God, that is, in the presence of God, infinitely heightened it. Their mistake was to regard God as something external, and in effect to assume that God was sinned against only occasionally. But God is not something external, like a police constable. It's not that God is external to you, watching you. God and you are intimately related. God is internal. What one must look to is the fact that the self has the conception of God and nevertheless does not do what God wants, that the self is disobedient. So sin and disobedience are very closely wrapped up. Nor is it just now and then that God is sinned against, since every sin is before God. Or rather, what really makes human guilt into sin is that the guilty person was conscious of being before God, in the presence of God. So I think that's quite important in terms of understanding sin, and therefore understanding despair, and therefore understanding Kierkegaard's conception of the self. That is, that sin is disobedience. Sin consists in a kind of rebellion, disobedience, flagrant flouting of the authority of God. And again, we have to look inside ourselves and ask, well, does this really resonate? Or does this make sense to us? Why would we consciously, purposely sin against God?